welcome back to Animal Crossing New Horizons. I'm Dear Darling, as we see what's going on on our lovely island of Fawnhallow today, where you can probably tell by today's title, I am going to be talking about Chicory, A Colourful Tale, because if you're new to this sort of series, or what things that sort of do is when I finish playing a game, I'll talk about it in my Animal Crossing series rather than actually in the game itself, because that's just kind of the vibe Animal Crossing brings. I'm not going to be recreating anything from Chicory, etc, etc. Anything like that. This is going to be an informal review and just thoughts about Chicory, A Colourful Tale and that stuff in general. So yeah, and you might be like, wow, you finished this in very soon after that review, and you know, I did. The endings almost coincided. So anyway, hello there everyone. Right now in Fawnhallow, it's 4:48 PM on Monday, June 13th, 2022. I can't read. Yeah, basically, on the whole, I'll warn you before I get to any like big spoilers or anything, or when I start spoiling things. I'm just going to say my general thoughts now. On the whole, really enjoyed Chicory, Colourful Tale. And I think that's very obvious. If you've seen the sort of games I like, Chicory, Colourful Tale is absolutely... There was no question about it. Chicory, Colourful Tale was going to be one of them, you know. I really love story sort of based games, and especially when the story based games have a strong focus on the characters that you're in the first place, rather than necessarily, I don't know what the alternative would be, I guess the environment, or like lore in that sort of sense. So yeah, I really like a colourful cast ensemble of characters, etc, that sort of thing. And I think Chicory managed to blend stuff very well with the mechanics. Like it's a thing where it's a very fun sort of premise in the first place, with you know, basically the world being a blank canvas and using your paintbrushes to paint everything. They combine it reasonably well with the exploration. I'd say the exploration was reasonably fun. I don't think it... I'm not gonna, you know, I mean, I feel like it's a normal thing to be like more harshly critical of things you super like, but I'm not going to say it was like, wow, like mind-boggling re-exploration or anything like that. It was fine, is probably what I'd say. It was enjoyable. Its backtracking was meh, but I didn't hate it. It just like was good, you know. Is probably what I'd say. Just nothing extremely noteworthy. What was more noteworthy was the characters and the story, which they weave together very well. The creators, very small team who created it actually. I was very surprised. I knew it was a small team, but I didn't realise quite how small. I forgot what I was saying. Yeah, but the story weaves things together very well. The characters are all very memorable, I think, apart from their names, which, because, you know, they're just food names, it ended up being surprisingly difficult for me to remember most of the characters' names. But it tied in with essential mechanics of the actual painting things. I think they did a very good job with that entire thing, like using painting both as a puzzle mechanic for exploration and, you know, that sort of thing, but also using it as the literal... the literal way that you normally use art, and as a way to like self-express and, you know, create pieces of art in the first place. I thought, you know, that was a very, you know, fun way to tie these two different sort of things together, and Chicory does it honestly pretty well on the whole. I think one thing that Chicory actually does incredibly well is a very nice sort of sense of progression, I think, of it. Like Chicory, I'm not sure quite how to put it, except for I guess Chicory, it doesn't really feel like... The sense of FOMO you get from skipping things in Chicory does not really feel like that big a deal, I suppose, is what I mean to say. But it also feels like it doesn't like sort of overstay its welcome. In a lot of cases, like the collectibles, for one, there are a lot of in-game systems in game to help you actually get a certain collectibles. You know, I'll talk about that more later, I suppose. There's a lot of in-game systems to help you hint towards getting collectibles, but, you know, it's okay if you miss out on some collectibles in the first place, because you don't really need it 100% of the game. I mean, sorry, you do need it. You don't really need 100% of the game, I suppose. Like, but the core experience is very much contained within just like the story of the main campaign itself. Getting all the collectibles is just very. It feels like a side quest, but it feels like a worthwhile side quest for people who like doing that sort of things, is what I say, because the rewards you get at the end seem to perfectly lie as a prize for people who would like to do that thing in the first place. So really, for the average person, if you don't want to collect all things, yeah, totally fine. And I feel like what Chicory does pretty well is, yeah, as I say, things don't... I never got to the point, I feel like, in Chicory where I was just like, this part has been going on too long. Things always felt very sort of like neatly wrapped up. Like, you know, you start the chapter and you do this, you do something in it, and then like it neatly wraps up, and like, or like, the conflict happens, etc, etc. It like the story beats happen. It's a very well paced game, I suppose, is what I'd say. Which is something I think sort of flies under the radar a lot of times, because it's a bit difficult to notice a well paced game, I think, a lot of time. But I mean, the most obvious way that you can tell if a game is well paced is when you're playing it. Have you ever thought, oh, that was over way too quickly, or man, this is dragging on a bit too long. And I can't think of a moment. Invent a catchphrase. Just be like, wow, I don't know, I need to think of something. Why not? No, why are you stupid? Oh, did you say something now? Oh, you can't back out of it. How about... Boom. Booyah. It's so lame. Oh no, I can't be that lame. I'll say boo. How about that? Done. Just like you're surprising people. Boo, that's what we're going with. Sorry, and I didn't mean to accidentally do that phrase thing. But yeah, I think the most obvious way to tell if a game's not as well paced is if there are moments where you're playing a game being like, whoa, okay, I felt like we just sped past that entire thing, or there are moments where you're just like, oh, it's just like I got the gist of it, like it's going on too long. I feel like the parts in Chicory which maybe I felt like might have dragged on too long were mainly just like the collectibles at the end, which really I was only doing just to 100% complete. But really, after doing it, like I did like a prize, but I didn't feel like a strong pressure to actually collect everything in the first place, rather than just to be able to give myself a sort of epilogue, I think, to the actual series itself. And I think a lot of it being well paced is the fact that since it's a rather open-ended creative game in the first place, you can spend as much time as you want doing certain things like painting or whatever have you, or doing like these little side quests, and there's no real like obligation to do them. Like the main story campaign sort of there still in the first place, and that's never really going anywhere. Okay, now we're probably start getting into spoiler territory. So if you don't want to get spoiled at Chicory Colorful Tale, then I'd recommend you stop watching now, just in case I accidentally spoil something, which ended up being crucial. So yeah, obviously, the main part I really liked is the characters. I feel like the characters, one, their designs are all very distinctive and very unique, and all the characters, even the side characters, they all managed to project their personality very quickly, just sort of like immediately being like, oh, within the first few sentences, first few minutes of just talking with them, you know what they're like, you know what they're going to be like, and that sort of thing, and they sort of like implant that as a seed inside your brain, so you sort of remember them. I think like you can still think back to like an earlier luncheon, like what characters do you meet? Like obviously you got your main character, who I understand the default name is Pizza, even though in my playthrough is Spaghetti. I tried and refer them as Pizza because that's what most people refer to them as. Pizza is a very sort of charming like character, like they always want to do their best to help others and that sort of thing, but they feel a bit like wayward, they don't really know what they're doing with their life, and their sort of journey of their discovery I think is very nice, because Chicory has a sort of like overarching thematics of basically not creativity necessarily, but like creation I suppose itself, and like the sort of turmoils you might run into, especially as someone who works in creative processes, etc. And it touches on a lot of different things, like it touches, like, there's a huge amount of themes going on, like your own self-worth, I suppose, like creating just for other people or creating just for yourself, etc. There's things of like mental health, and how it tends to, how a lot of problems especially tend to affect artists, especially things like imposter syndrome and the sort of external pressure you put on yourself, especially to live up to expectations. When I say a lot of these things, and you might be confused about me saying, if you haven't played a game, why I say it focus so much on like from a creative side of things rather than necessarily we sound like quite generic story beats for things to go through. Like it's not like mental health doesn't affect could affect anybody or that sort of thing, and imposter syndrome is something which comes up with all different fields. But I think what Chicory does well, people may take as a criticism, but I don't think that's particularly fair, is that they know what they're focusing on, like when they come to story. Like while these sort of things can be broadly applicable to many sort of things, they do have a more specific not take on it, but like a specific narrative of it on how it particularly affects creativity and creative processes and things like that. So it's a sort of thing where I feel like maybe Chicory might not land as well for every single person who plays the game, because while these things are generic, while the concepts are generic, the sort of like medium and process, or the lens they're used to mostly comment on is through the lens of creative processes, I suppose, in Chicory, which is fine, I think. Don't get me wrong, it's probably a good thing, because through specificity you can actually target certain people's more certain people's problems are much more like accurately. It feels like closer to the heart rather than something much more generic, and it's done well enough. I think the story can be sort of like reapplied to things much more generically. So even if you aren't a creative person, even if you don't think yourself as a creative person, are unbothered by that entirely, or you're not really someone who creates much, then I still feel like the general broad strokes can apply to you. But what I think it does well is it really targets in on like artists and that sort of thing, and their own sort of like relationship, because like big themes as well as like relationships between the artist and their art and things that they create in that way, and especially through like emotional projection and how those sort of things tie together and like the meaning behind things, which they can be applicable to other things, but I feel like art obviously is kind of the forefront runner for the most obvious thing that it would be applicable to. I mean, obviously Chicory wears that sort of thematic on its sleeve. It's like the entire thing is about art in the first place, which is why I'd say if you play the game, and if you play the game, you like story games, then maybe Chicory doesn't sit quite I think there's certainly people out there who probably find it good but not great in that sort of aspect, and probably my assumption would be that the reason it might not sit perfectly, but might not quite click with everybody, would be the fact that it's specifically it hones in a lot about art, but it's got tons of other things. Like another very interesting theme would be the idea of a story and about mentoring, and that sort of thing, about teaching, I suppose, others, because obviously the wielder is basically a long line of wielders of basically each previous iteration of a wielder talking and teaching the next iteration of wielder, and you meet a few wielders throughout the game. Of course, you yourself become a wielder. You meet Chicory, the one before you meet Blackberry, the one before her, and you meet I think Cardamom, the one before Blackberry, and you can see how all the wielders are specifically different. They all like interpret and go about art their own special way. They all have different interpretations. They all have different ideas about what's the best way, etc., etc. And I think it's interesting to see their sort of interactions, because obviously that's a very good reflection of real life. Obviously people are very different in real life, but especially when it comes to art, it can be surprising about all the different types of artists there really are in the first place. You get people like Cardamom, who are so like laid back and chilled with mostly everything, and you get people like Blackberry, who tend to be rather stern, rather you might say uptight, but it's a sort of thing where, even though what I think is a nice thing, which I always really love when stories don't fall into this trap, is portraying people who shouldn't be villains as villains. And I feel like Blackberry is one where it's sort of like, if the story was not done as well, Blackberry would be painted basically straight up as a villain, which I feel like is a bit unfair to Blackberry. For Blackberry, just as it's sort of revealed throughout the game, and especially when you talk to her, and when you get to a certain point later on in the game where you see more of a backstory between Blackberry and Chicory's arguments, Blackberry clearly just has a different perspective to art, one which works intrinsically for her, and one which she thought would be the best way for Chicory to grow as an artist in particular, and her own sort of like lesson of learning about not how to properly teach, but like understanding her mistakes, I think would be the better way to put it. Because Chicory's a very stern person, like things need to be sort of like aiming for perfection all the time. She's the type of person to put strong pressure on her. A lot of people work well in that sort of environment, being like, under a strict a strict teacher, etc., etc. But clearly it didn't work for Chicory, and part of that is due to Blackberry's own fault, but a part of that, as the game talks about quite openly, is Chicory is to blame as well, for not being able to not being able to deal with the problems, because I don't want to make it be like, oh, Chicory obviously has some sort of mental health issues that she has to deal with, but I don't mean to be like, oh, it's Chicory's fault for not being able to deal with them, but obviously like I suppose more like repressing them and not being able to I suppose try and solve them or admit that that's a problem in the first place, resulted in like just like a huge uncontrollable falling out, and leading to things to pile up. Because even if you obviously with mental health issues and that sort of thing, you certainly have a lot of leeway and understanding, but like part of it is also like Chicory's own understanding and acceptance that things shouldn't have ended up this way, and she's through a lot of her own actions, whether putting aside whether they should be justified or not, have in fact just caused problems and pushed down later down the line, which her next protege would have to deal with, in this case being Pizza. But it's through both Pizza's and Chicory's understanding of their own shortcomings that the game really thrives, and seeing their own sort of like character development, and the interactions between the two, Pizza and Chicory especially, are really, really nice. The sort of moments of reflection on each other and how they both support each other despite the fact that they're both going through very, tumultuous times, I suppose is how I describe it. Like, with Chicory being like all this pressure that was sort of building up and welling up inside of her, like how she was aspiring, how she wanted to be a wielder for her entire life, and she aspired to it, and then the combination of incredibly harsh teachings from Blackberry, then her own sort of overzealous idea of perfection and expectation from herself, and the demands that were put on her by not just by the sort of like general populace, ended up breaking her and causing a lot more problems further down the line. And then like talking to Spaghetti and her sort of like coming to understand that, and like learning to sort of like better have a better outlet, I suppose, for her own emotions and that sort of thing, rather than having things bottle up and then resulting in all these like corrupted trees growing and whatever. And what I think, going back to my point about how it really talks about, artists and creators and their sort of like relationship with mental health, because it eventually you sort of find out how like these sort of growing tree problems are something which was happened with like every single creator wielder throughout history. It's just never been quite as bad as it has been with Chicory's. Chicory's is sort of like a breaking point of like years and years of it building up from inherited sort of like trauma from previous generations of wielders to now Chicory now bearing the burden herself. This seems like a Lily or possibly Fauna bag, so we'll have a chat with Lily since she's over here, but they're both out and about. I thought it was super interesting, and it was also really interesting to see Pizza's perspective on the entire thing as well, because Pizza was someone who is not an artist, and I think that's a very nice way to do it, because I'd imagine most people who actually play the game probably might not be artists. I mean, you might say it's an art-based game, but it's not like an extremely art-based game, as in, what I mean by that, it's not like it's an art medium game. It's not like a video game where the entire thing is literally make painting and done. It's not like that VR art game. It's not like, I forgot what that, it's like Passepartout or something. I can't remember what it's called, where it's just about like make art, sell art. It's a game where it like interweaves many things, where even when you're not an artist, it should be like enjoyable in that place, and having Pizza as someone who clearly is not an artist in the first place, or not a trained artist, I should say. She's someone who just sort of fell into a situation by happenstance, and the story does very well with sort of like tackling the sort of pressures and problems that she's coming up against, which I think would probably be quite reflective on the player himself, especially because, as I say, a lot of the players probably wouldn't be artists in the first place. And seeing how the main character you play as actually has a personality is also really refreshing. I think it was in the first place. It's something which people could definitely very easily sort of like what's a word? Because when you have like blank slate main characters, it's so other people can sort of like put their own personality into it. I can't remember what it's called. Excuse me. When it's just like imagining yourself in their situation, I suppose. I think Pizza's actually written well enough to have their own personality, but also, open enough where you can, the player can put their own sort of, conceive themselves, I suppose, in Pizza, is perhaps the way I want to see it. And I suppose that's reflective, like, of the actual environment you're in Chicory itself. So I suppose it's more of a sign of a well-weaved together, sort of story, where the thematics and the mechanics both lend to and aid the story and its storytelling in general. So yeah, that was certainly a highlight, I think, for me, was listening to them having their conversations, especially during the wielder trials themselves. The ones where you just have like one-on-one moments with Chicory where they sort of talk about things and like, them coming to terms with it, and especially obviously using the mechanics for the boss battles themselves, of to sort of like which were like manifestations of it in the most like fears, I think were also super notable, like with Pizzas and them seeing Chicory as not an apt wielder, and especially as a start of a story, them sort of like denying it, being like, Chicory always believes in me, and then the acceptance, but later on about being like, yeah, Chicory basically did just kind of choose me randomly, but that's not necessarily, it doesn't like take away from my worth or what I can do, or nor does it discredit Chicory's decision or faith, I suppose, in the first place. Happenstance can start as a happenstance, but you know, the fact it continues onwards should be more reflective of the actual spirit of it rather than just the beginning. No, so that was pretty cool. You know, Chicory and Pizza definitely were highlights. The only criticism I would have about the story is that I feel like I kind of want to see a bit more, which is often a good thing to criticize on, because if you kind of want to have your audience, your consumers, wanting more, I suppose, by the end of your story, right? I mean, I don't think there'd be anything worse than writing a story and then have a story being like, wow, that was like enough for me. Like I ended up like trying to skip through it or something like that, which wasn't a case of Chicory. Like I wanted to talk more with like Blackberry, especially. Like, I mean, it certainly felt like Chicory and Pizza's stories, while they didn't come to much of a definitive end, you could see how it would come to a much more definitive end, I suppose. But you certainly felt their story arc progress and that sort of thing. I kind of want to see more of Blackberry's, is what I'd say, especially with the sort of realisation that Blackberry was one of the manifestations, I suppose, that you saw inside. Which I like the idea that it's... the trees and the corruption was a lot of the manifestation was just the previous wielders, but I suppose it just became more ambiguous, you know, as previous wielders came and go, because like obviously you face yourself quite early on, you face Chicory, and you know it's just Chicory. Oh, we got bit by a mosquito apparently, and you see Chicory quite explicitly, but then you see a Blackberry, you fight Blackberry herself as a boss battle, but she's much more abstracted, you know, things are much more hazy, things are fuzzier, and you kind of face Cardamom. You get like kind of hints that Cardamom had his own problems as well to deal with, because he appears in like with the final boss fights within the attacks or something with like a very sad face which sort of like melts away. So you can sort of see like the previous wielders, I think, and their own sort of struggles, or like the insinuations of their own struggles. Would like to see a bit more of it, but you know, I understand why they didn't as well, because you just kind of don't, I suppose, need to show any more than that entire thing in the first place. Apologies, a little bit of a pause there. I don't remember where I got up to about talking about Chicory, but I guess we'll just do a hard swerve from whatever we were talking about, or maybe not a hard swerve from whatever we were talking about, onto other things about Chicory, which I also really liked. Obviously, a thing which is praised a lot in Chicory is the soundtrack, and yeah, the soundtrack is fantastic. I mean, there's no two ways about it. It's just really good, and really sets his sort of like environment and the atmosphere very well, I think, in Chicory. Like, I feel like many times throughout the series, you're going to be like, oh, this soundtrack's really nice. Or like, oh, I like the music in this part. It does really well, and I think, especially since it's such like an emotionally charged game, I think, in the first place. The fact that art can, emotionally charged and has strong art like thematics. The fact that the music is so strongly expressive, I suppose, is particularly good. Like, the ones I don't know which soundtracks in particular are my favourite. Like, I need to listen to like all of them individually, so I know their names, but I don't know their names. But especially the ones doing like the boss battles are really, really nice. It's probably what I'll say. And yeah, I mean the sound design of the game itself is actually pretty nice. I'm just like trying to think of it through the devs who actually worked on the game, because if you didn't know, you know, I suppose it's major spoilers. Before 100%ing the game, you get to basically the devs have all the different, or maybe not all the different devs, but at least some of the different devs have left behind like a sort of like little note through some other characters, like a little speech basically about their sort of process of working on the game. There was only 5 of them. I don't know if it's only 5 people who worked on it in total, but if so, I'm like, whoa, that is crazy small. That's incredibly impressive. Incroyable. But one thing which is another thing which is like overlooked, I think, a lot of the time, where people, you know, don't give enough credit, is the sound design is really nice in the game. Like the fact there's little things like, wait, I don't even know how to do the sound like like that. It feels very, I'm not sure how to put it. Like, I want to say it feels very indie, but like that sounds more like an insult than what I mean. It's charming, I suppose. Everything's got a very sort of sweet charm to it. Like all the menu noises are just like, all the noises are very satisfying. That sort of thing. That's what I was saying. It sort of all blends together in a very sort of like light-hearted, creative feel and charm that Chicory have in the first place, which I think is something which doesn't get enough credit necessarily. What else I talked about? So, you know, sound effects, the music. Like, I can't really say much else about music except for it just really is really nice. That's the long and short of it. It just really adds to the atmosphere. Like, I feel like I should say more about it because it really is like very good, but I'm not really sure what to say. I mean, there's nice little details with like the recorder basically being used quite prominently early on, especially, which is, you know, very reminiscent of, like, at least for me, primary school sort of teachings, you know, where everyone learns and use a primary school what? Everyone in primary school learns how to sort of play the recorder. So it's sort of, I don't know, reflective of course, you know, Pizza and their sort of like them learning to use a brush and paint colours and all that sort of thing in the first place. There's a lot of nice artwork in the game, you know, both with the character designs and the environments, and the art itself actually used to promote the game and for the actual art piece and the art academy, the art school pieces, I think were really cool at the same time. Oh, what was that? Another pause? Whoops. Well, unfortunately now my entire trailer for whatever I was talking about for Chicory has been interrupted, so I hope I finished whatever point I was making last time. But well, what else can we talk about in Chicory? No, we probably haven't already touched on. I don't know, it's just a very sort of like heartfelt story, I thought, which it does pretty well, you know. It's something which made me get invested in the characters and their, well, I should say it mainly got me invested into Chicory and Pizza, to be fair, but that's where most of the focus lies. I mean, there is only so much scope I suppose you can have in a game in the first place, and probably it would be the case where if you started like putting the spotlight on too many other characters, it ends up being quite muddied in exactly what it's trying to do. But I think it basically does what it does quite well. And the side characters are very much charming enough that I was interested in their own sort of story, especially like I'm trying to think of some notable ones. Radish, is that her name? I think that's her name. And her journey with like her bitterness, especially to the whole established system, I suppose, with Bewilder and everything in the first place, and how it sort of like all comes crashing down when Pizza, just complete nobody who hasn't even tried, I suppose, to become bewildered, ends up being bewildered in the first place, and how she's actually, you know, in my opinion, she's rightfully kind of angry, but, you know, perhaps unfairly taking it out on Pizza in the first place, which is, you know, not cool. And it's a game where a thing which I think was cool is it's not afraid to show main characters, not just your character, but like other like important characters in a bad light, I think. Because of course, you know, everyone's got flaws and that sort of thing. No one's flawless. People got like their own like weaknesses or strengths or whatever. It's cool to see them like actually feel more like human, I suppose. It gives it a bit more of a personal touch to see them in a bad light, like make bad decisions or do bad things, which they later do regret. And then, you know, that's an important part in Chicory, is that they talk about the things that they've messed up and like regret, and then, you know, sort of like make up for later on. Which is why I think I praised Chicory and Pizza so much, is because they got the biggest moments, I suppose, to actually show that sort of like self-reflection they had with each other, and like their communication, or I suppose lack thereof of communication, which really sort of caused problems of themselves. And you see bits of it with like Radish, especially when Radish, you open up a cafe thing, sort of thing, you go out of your way to help Radish, and then she apologises to you, and all that, and you have a talk with her later on about how, you know, her own sort of perspective on things, and how, you know, her own realisation that she was unfairly taking it out on you, and Blackberry and her own sort of like guilt over like she just wanted the best of Chicory, but, you know, didn't understand, but didn't realise at the time, like it was sort of untoward pressure that she was putting under them, and no matter, you sort of see with Blackberry's own development, but, you know, it's a bit, you don't, there's not as much spotlight on Blackberry, which is a bit of a shame, is what I'd say. Because I thought she was an interesting character, or an interesting perspective on like creatives and art people. Creatives and art people, that's such a weird way to put it. Yeah, people who create art, and like her own sort of very much more different, like antagonistic style, I suppose, which, you know, didn't need to be so antagonistic in the first place. And, you know, her boss battle was certainly one of the most interesting ones, I think. Or the cutscene beforehand was actually seeing like Chicory. You actually see Chicory like at her worst, with like her completely snapping at Blackberry, and Blackberry sort of like guilt that she shows afterwards, because Blackberry before then had been quite sort of like stoic, shall we say. I don't know, what other sort of standout characters were there You might be like, who's your favourite main character? That's really hard to say. Like, I guess it would be Chicory and Pizza, but, you know, it's also a bit unfair because they basically get the entire spotlight, which is fair enough because that's, like, their story. But out of the side characters, which one I like the most, I very much like Marzipan because if you don't know who she was the curator, the museum curator in the art exhibit. And, you know, she didn't get that much spotlight, but she had a very nice spotlight, especially during Radish's side quest about that sort of thing. Yeah, about like Radish wanting to be in Leventer's gallery and Marzipan being like, okay, I mean, you can't really be in here because this is meant to be from Wilders in first place, but you don't want to be in here, if anything, because this is more like a historical documentation. How about you try this and whatever, blah, 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 blah. And you're just like, oh, you know, it was really sweet. And she's got some really nice insights about the actual art exhibits from previous Wilders and their artworks themselves and like how they cover it. Because I think it's a thing where people, you know, the curtains are blue, sort of like rhetoric, where people are just like, oh, you know, art's pointless because like you can determine meaning from things which the artist didn't necessarily intend. Which, you know, you know my thoughts about that, which I sort of like refute that idea, where I think art is 50% about what the artist is trying to convey anyway. They've got their own meanings and things and directions where they intended things to go in. But for the other 50% is about basically how you interpret the story themselves. It could be completely different. You can like interpret things completely differently from what the artist wanted, etc. But that doesn't mean it loses any meaning, I think, for you personally. Or you shouldn't detract in that sense. And I feel like perpetuating that sort of idea about, you know, the blue, if you don't know what blue curtains thing, it was just like, oh, you know, artist writes the curtains are blue, English teacher, it means is reflective of his like sadness or whatever, have an actual meaning, the curtains were blue, you know, it's obviously meant to be taken in jest and lightheartedness, but I don't really agree, you know, with the sort of heart of the comedy, I suppose. And they say, you know, the best comedy has like kernels of truth in it. So that's why I'm like criticizing this joke so much for really no apparent reason. I forgot what I was saying about this. Yeah, but anyway, she does a very good job of like explaining about the sort of art things, and she makes it very clear that it's her own sort of interpretation as someone who's like taken time to basically study and learn about these sort of things in the first place. So it's not like framed as like this is definitely what the artists intend to do, but this is like a very common interpretation of it, or a very strong interpretation that was probably intended, etc., etc. And I was like, that's really cool. You know, it's very insightful to see like artwork, because especially with a lot of high level art. I'm not here to comment about the monetary worth of that sort of thing and the weirdness that goes on in that sort of the financial sector, but I feel like with a lot of art, you know, certain art resonates with different people, and a lot of people, I guess it's harder to appreciate a lot of like the great works of art history, myself included, because I'm not like an art student. I don't know necessarily the story behind it, and the fact that they actually had a character in there basically being the analogous version of that for Picnic and Chicory's World, I thought was very lovely, and it was very interesting to see what she would say about all the things. What else to talk about? The art classes, super fun. I would say I'm very curious to see what other people have done. I wonder if I should make like a compilation of basically all the art pieces I've done. It might be fun, might not be fun. I don't really know. To be perfectly honest, I haven't made a YouTube short for ages. Mainly because I don't. Not because they're very difficult to edit or anything. It's just like, I don't know what things to make into YouTube shorts in the first place. It's a bit difficult for me to just like pick out moments which I find funny in the first place. So, you know, that's the main reason why. But anyway, yeah, Chicory Colourful Tale. Long and short of it, I really, really enjoyed it, to be perfectly honest. It's definitely one of the favourite games I think I've played on this channel. And I mean, I feel like I kind of knew it was going to be like one of my favourites ever since like I started playing it. Because you know my favourites are like story-based games like Undertale, Night in the Woods. Anyone could just be able to tell, be like, oh man, you would love Chicory. And yep, you're right. I love Chicory Colourful Tale. It's a fantastic game. And, you know, it's sad it's over, but it's also like, I feel like it's a good place for it to end in the first place, you know. I feel like it rounded off its story. Don't want it like extending on even longer with me just going like, what's the point of this? Yeah. Oh yeah, one thing, oh hello, don't fall asleep on me, Switch. One thing I really loved in the game but didn't neglected to mention is the fact that how they incorporate hints into the game. The fact that you just call your parents basically to be like, where do I go in the game, and your mother gives you a general clue and your father gives you very specific instructions of what to do. A fantastic way to incorporate hints into the game. Love it. What other really good things they do that with collectibles as well. I wish I could have been more specific maybe in the post game, but that's fine. To be perfectly honest, it's for people, I suppose, it's mainly for people who love the exploration in the first place and finding all the secrets, which, you know, you know my thoughts and pieces about that. I like doing it the first time through, but we're going back and, you know, going through a second time is not as interesting to me, so I didn't find the process of finding the hidden presents all that enticing. It's really cool that we got to do developers commentary and that sort of thing. Oh, another thing, Chicory Colourful Tale is fantastic for accessibility options. They have tons of options from what I remember the menu, and the one that was most notable for me, not personally for me, but I was like, oh, that's a really like cool idea, which I don't know why more games don't do this, is it has trigger warnings for like cutscenes, where like before a cutscene appears, it'll be like, there's a trigger warning, there's going to be depictions of like not self-harm, but like self-hatred and that sort of thing, or like possible abusive relationships, etc, etc. You can skip this cutscene if that makes you uncomfortable. And I'm like, yeah, obviously games should do this way more often, but that's just a very, you know, it's just a nice thing to have. And Chicory's full of these sort of things. You can turn off like all these sort of different bits and pieces if you want or don't want certain elements of Chicory affecting you and your gameplay. The menu itself is also written in a very like cool, casual way, which I thought was very endearing in a sense. So yeah, Chicory's got a very nice charm to it overall. I don't think I really have anything else to say on the matter. If I do, then you know, as with all of my sort of like informal, unorganized reviews, I will have just forgotten. But yeah. Anyway, that's all I'd say. If you got your own thoughts about Chicory Colourful Tale, do leave them in the comments. I'll respond to them maybe in like a week's time or something. We'll see. But, you know, I will respond to them and I'll read them. I certainly will read all of them. But yeah, on that note, I'm going to round off this episode here. So if you have been watching, thank you very much. It's been Animal Crossing New Horizons. I've been Dear Darling. Any likes, comments, subscription, shares are greatly appreciated. Join me, Dear Darling Discord. Follow me on Twitter down below. Hope we see each other again. But for now, it's our farewell. So until next time, bye-bye for now.